Chapter 9. Expecting dogs, China woke from red dreams of refrigerator-chilled guns and exploding heads. But there were no dogs. She was alone in the living room and all was quiet. The Dobermans were not padding back and forth on the porch, and when she was finally able to lift her head, she saw no dogs at the undraped window. They were outside, calmer now because they realized that their time would come. Watching the door and windows, waiting to see her face, alert for the snick of a latch, the rasp of a hinge. She was in so much pain that she was surprised to have regained consciousness. She was more surprised that her head was clear. One pain was separate from and more urgent than all her other distresses. Unlike the agonies of tortured bones and muscles, this painful pressure could be relieved easily, and she wouldn't even have to put herself through the gruesome ordeal of moving from where she lay. "Hell no," she mumbled, and slowly she sat up. Getting to her feet, she disturbed deep hurts that had slept as long as she had been lying on the floor, but woke as soon as she began to rise. Grindings in her bones and hot flares in her muscles. Some were intense enough, at least initially, to make her freeze and gasp for breath. But by the time she was standing tall, she knew there was no single pain so terrible that it would cripple her. And while the burden of her combined agonies was daunting, she was going to be able to carry it. She didn't have to carry the heavy chair any longer. It lay on the floor around her in fragments and splinters, and none of her chains were encumbered by it. According to the mantel clock, the time was 3 minutes till 8, which unsettled her. The last she remembered, it had been 10 minutes past 7. She wasn't sure how long she'd taken to break free from the chair, but she suspected that she had lain unconscious for half an hour, perhaps longer. The sweat had dried on her body, and her hair was only slightly damp at the nape of her neck, so half an hour is probably correct. This realization made her feel weak and uncertain again. If Vess could be believed, China still had 4 hours until he returned, but there was much to be done, and 4 hours might not be time enough. China sat on the edge of the sofa. Freed from the pine dining chair, she was at last able to reach the carabiner on the short chain between her ankles. This steel coupling connected the shorter chain to the longer one that had wrapped the chair and the table pedestal. After screwing open the metal sleeve to reveal the gate and the carabiner, she disconnected herself from the longer chain. Her ankles remained cuffed, and on her way to the stairs to the second floor, she still had to shuffle. She switched on the stairwell light and laboriously climbed the narrow stairs, moving first her left foot and then her right onto each tread. Because of the hobbling chain, she was unable to ascend 1 foot per tread. Step over step as she normally would have done, and her progress was slow. She kept a 2-hand grip on the handrail. With the heavy chair gone from her back, she was no longer precariously balanced, but she remained wary of tripping in her fetters. Past the landing, halfway up the second flight, all of her pains and the fear of falling and the hot pressure in her bladder combined to double her over with severe stomach cramps. She leaned against the wall of the stairwell, clutching the handrail, suddenly sheathed in sour sweat, moaning low and wordlessly in misery. She was certain that she was going to pass out, tumble backward, and break her neck. But the cramps passed, and she continued climbing. Soon she reached the second floor. She switched on the hall light and found 3 doors. Those to the left and right were closed, but the one at the end of the hallway stood open, revealing a bathroom. In the bathroom, although her hands were manacled and trembling badly, she managed to unbuckle her belt, unbutton her jeans, unzip and skin down jeans and panties. Sitting, she was hit by more waves of cramps, and these were markedly more vicious than those she had endured on the stairs. She had refused to wet herself at the kitchen table as Vess had wanted her to do, refused to be reduced to that degree of helplessness. Now she couldn't make water, though she desperately wanted to do that, needed to do it to stop the cramps. And she wondered if she had held out so long that a bladder spasm was pinching off the flow. Such a thing was possible, and abruptly the cramps grew more severe, as if confirming her diagnosis. She felt as if her guts were being rolled through a wringer, but then the cramps passed and relief came. With the sudden flood, she was surprised to hear herself say, "China Shepherd, untouched and alive, and able to pee." Then she was simultaneously laughing and sobbing, not with relief, but with a weird sense of triumph. Getting free of the table, shattering and shaking off the chair, and not wetting her pants seemed together to be an act of endurance and of courage equivalent to setting foot on the moon with the first astronauts to land there, slogging through blinding blizzards to the pole with Admiral Peary, P-E-A-R-Y, or storming the beaches of Normandy against the might of the German army. She laughed to herself, laughed until tears spilled down her face. Nevertheless, she still felt that degree of triumph. She knew how small, even pathetic, her triumph was, but she felt that it was big. "Rotten hell," she said to Edgeler Vess, and she hoped that someday she would have the chance to say it to his face just before she pulled the trigger and blew him out of this world. She had so much pain in her back from the battering that she'd endured, especially low around her kidneys, that when she was done, she checked in the toilet bowl for blood. She was relieved to see that her urine was clear. Glancing in the mirror above the sink, however, she was shocked by her reflection. Her short hair was tangled and lank with sweat. The right side of her face, along the jaw, seemed to be smeared with a purple ink, and when she touched it, she discovered that this was the trailing edge of a bruise that mottled the entire side of her neck. Where it wasn't bruised or smeared with dirt, her skin was gray and grainy, as if she had been suffering through a long and difficult illness. Her right eye was fiery, no white visible anymore, just the dark iris and the darker pupil floating in an elliptical pool of blood. Both the bloodied eye and the clear left eye gazed back at her with a haunted expression so unnerving that she turned away from her own reflection in confusion and fear. The face in the mirror was that of a woman who had already lost some battle. It wasn't the face of a winner. China tried to press that dispiriting thought out of her mind at once. What she had seen was the face of a fighter, no longer the face of a mere survivor, but a fighter. Every fighter sustains some punishment, both physical and emotional. Without anguish and agony, there was no hope of winning. She shuffled from the bathroom to the door on the right side of the upstairs hall, which opened onto Vess's bedroom. Simple furniture and a minimum of it. A neatly made bed with the beige chenille spread, no paintings, no B-I-B-E-L-O-T-S, or decorative accessories, no books or magazines or any newspapers folded open to crossword puzzles. This was nothing more than a place to sleep, not a room where he lingered or lived. Where he truly lived was in the pain of others, in a storm of death, in the calm eye of the storm where all was orderly, but where the wind howled on every side. China checked the nightstand drawers for a gun, but didn't find one. She found no phone either. The large walk-in closet was 10 feet deep and as wide as the bedroom, essentially a room of its own. At a glance, the closet held nothing useful to her. She was sure to discover something worthwhile if she searched, maybe even a well-hidden gun. But there were built-in cabinets with laden shelves and packed drawers, and boxes were stacked on boxes. She would need hours to pour through everything. More urgent tasks awaited her. She emptied the dresser drawers on the floor, but they contained only socks, underwear, sweaters, sweatshirts, and a few rolled belts. No guns. Across the hall from Vess's bedroom was a Spartan study, bare walls, blackout blinds instead of drapes. On 2 long work tables stood 2 computers, each with its own laser printer. Of the numerous items of computer-related equipment, she could identify some, but was mystified by others. Between the long tables was an office chair. The floor was not carpeted. The bare wood was exposed, evidently to make it easier for Vess to roll between tables. The drab utilitarian room intrigued her. She sensed that it was an important place. Time was precious, but there was something here worth pausing to examine. She sat in the chair and looked around, bewildered. She knew that the world was wired these days, even into the hinterlands, but it seemed odd to find all this high-tech equipment in such a remote and rustic house. China suspected that Vess was set up to enter the internet, but there was no phone or modem in sight. She spotted 2 unused phone jacks in the baseboard. His meticulous security procedures had served him well again. She was stymied. What did he do here? On one of the tables were 6 or 8 ring-bound notebooks with colorful covers, and she opened the nearest. The binder was divided into 5 sections, each with the name of an agency of the federal government. The first was the Social Security Administration. The pages were filled with what seemed to be notes from Vess to himself regarding the trial and error method by which he had hacked his way into the administration's data files and had learned to manipulate them. The second divider was labeled U.S. Department of State, in parentheses Passport Agency. And judging by the following notes, Vess was engaged in an incomplete experiment to determine if, by a Byzantine route, he might be able to enter and control the passport agency's computerized records without being detected. Part of what he was doing, evidently, was preparing for the day when he slipped up in his, quote, homicidal adventuring, end quote, and required new identities. China didn't believe, however, that Vess's only projects were the altering of his public records and the obtaining of fake ID. She was troubled by the feeling that this room contained information about Vess that could be of vital importance to her own survival, if only she knew where to look for it. She put down the notebook and swiveled in the chair to face a second computer. Under one end of this table stood a 2-drawer file cabinet. She opened the top drawer and saw Pendaflex hanging files with blue tags. Each tag featured a person's name with the surname first. Each folder contained a 2-sheet dossier on a different law enforcement officer. And after a couple of minutes of investigation, China decided that they were deputies with the sheriff's department in the very county in which Vess's house is located. These dossiers provided all vital statistics on the officers, plus information about their families and their personal lives. A Xerox of each deputy's official ID photo was also attached. Did the freak see some advantage in collecting information on all the local cops' insurance against the day when he might find himself in a standoff with them? This effort seemed excessive even for one as meticulous as Edgeler Vess. On the other hand, excess was his philosophy. The lower drawer of the filing cabinet contained manila folders as well. The tabs of these also featured names like those in the upper drawer, but only surnames. In the first folder, labeled Elms, A-L-M-E-S, China found a full-page enlargement of the California driver's license of an attractive young blonde named Mia Lorinda Elms. Judging by the exceptional clarity, it wasn't a Xerox blow-up of the original license, but a digitized data transmission received on a phone line through a computer and reproduced on a high-quality laser printer. The only other items in the folder were 6 Polaroid photographs of Mia Lorinda Elms. The first 2 were close-ups from different angles. She was beautiful and terrified. This file drawer was Edgeler Vess's equivalent of a scrapbook. 4 more Polaroids of Mia Elms. Don't look. The next 2 were full-body shots. The young woman was naked in both, manacled. China closed her eyes, but opened them. She was compelled to look. Perhaps she was determined not to hide from anything anymore. In the 5th and 6th photos, the young woman was dead, and in the last, her beautiful face was gone, as if it had been blown off or sheared away. The folder and the photographs fluttered from China's hands to the floor, where they clicked against the wood and spun, and were still. She hid her face in her hands. She wasn't trying to block her mind from the gruesome image on the snapshot. Instead, she was striving to repress a 19-year-old memory of a farmhouse outside New Orleans, 2 visitors with a styrofoam cooler, a gun taken from the refrigerator, and the cold accuracy with which a woman named Memphis had fired 2 rounds. Memory, however, always has its way. The visitors who'd done business with Zach and Memphis before had been there to make a drug purchase. The cooler had been filled with packets of $100 bills. Maybe Zach didn't have the promised shipment, or maybe he and Memphis just needed more money than they could get from a sale. Whatever the reason, they decided to rip off the 2 men. Side note, I don't recall ever having read about Zach and Memphis in the gazillion times that I've read this book, but it also seems somewhat out of place. Maybe it'll fall into place in some point in the next few pages. It was mentioned they were mentioned in the last chapter, but I don't know what they have to do with the story. Anyhow. End of side note. Whatever the reason, they decided to rip off the 2 men. After the gunfire, China had hidden in the barn loft, certain that Memphis would kill them all. When Memphis and Ann found her, she fought them bitterly, but she was only 7 years old and no match for them. With owls hooting in alarm and taking flight from the rafters, the women dragged China out of the mice-infested hay and carried her to the house. Zach had been gone by then, having taken the bodies elsewhere, and Memphis had cleaned up the blood in the kitchen, while Ann had forced China to drink a shot of whiskey. China didn't want the whiskey, sealed her lips against it, but Ann said, "You're a wreck, for Christ's sake. You can't stop blubbering, and 1 shot isn't going to hurt you. This is what you need, kiddo. Trust Mama, this is what you need. A shot of good whiskey will break a fever, you know, and what you've got now is a kind of fever. Come on, you little wuss, it's not poison. Jesus, you can be a whiny little shit sometimes. Either you drink it quick, or I'll hold you down and pinch your nose shut, and Memphis will pour it in when you open your mouth to breathe. That how you want it?" So China drank the whiskey and then took a second shot with a few ounces of milk when her mother decided that she needed it. The booze made her dizzy and strange, but did not calm her. She'd appear calmer to them because, good little fisher that she was, she'd caught her fear and reeled it inside, where they could not see it. Even by the age of 7, she had begun to understand that a show of fear was dangerous because others interpreted it as weakness, and there was no place in this world for the weak. Later that night, Zach had returned with whiskey on his breath, too. He was exuberant, in a raucous and celebratory mood. He came straight to China and hugged her, kissed her on the cheek, took her by the hands, and tried to make her dance with him. That bastard Bobby, the last time he was here, I knew, by the way, he couldn't take his eyes off China, that he was hot for little girls. A genuine sicko. So tonight he walks in and his tongue just about uncurls to his knees when he sees her. You could have shot the geek 6 times, Memphis, before he might have noticed. Bobby had been the man sitting at the kitchen table talking to China, his beautiful gray eyes fixed intently on her, speaking directly to her, in a way that few adults ever spoke to kids, asking whether she liked kittens or puppies best, and did she want to grow up to be a famous movie star, or a nurse or a doctor or what. When Memphis shot him in the head. "The way our China girl here was dressed," Zach said excitedly, "Bobby just about totally forgot anyone else was here." The night was hot and swamp humid, and before the visitors arrived, China's mother had made her change out of her shorts and t-shirt into a brief yellow bikini swimsuit. But only the bottoms, because, child, you're going to get heat stroke in this weather. Although only 7, China was old enough to feel peculiar about going bare-chested. She didn't quite know why she felt that way. She'd gone bare-chested when she was younger, even just the previous summer when she was 6, and it was an awfully hot, sticky night. When Zach said that the way she was dressed had something to do with Bobby's forgetting that anyone else was in the room, China didn't understand what he meant. Years later, when she did understand, she had confronted her mother with it. Anne had laughed and said, "Oh, baby, don't get self-righteous on me. We get along by using what we've got. And one sure thing we girls have is our bodies. You're the perfect distraction. Anyway, poor dumb old Bobby never touched you, did he? He got to gawk at you a little, that's all. Well, Memphis went for the gun. Don't forget, sweetie, we were cut in for a piece of that pie and lived well on it for a while." And China had wanted to say, "But you used me. You put me right there in front of him where I'd see his head come apart, and I was only 7. All these years later, in Edgeler Vest's study, she could still hear the crash of the shot and see Bobby's face explode. The memory was as vivid as ever it had been. She didn't know what gun Memphis used, but the ammunition must have been high-caliber hollow-point lead wad cutters that expanded on impact, because the damage they inflicted had been tremendous. Side note, in this book, Dean Koontz doesn't and wouldn't, because it would be completely inappropriate to elaborate on the kind of bullet that Memphis used when killing Bobby, whoever these nefarious characters are, that I definitely don't ever recall reading about. I recall her being in his little study and finding his folders on the girls that he would murder, and him finding them through the DMV website, and then going to their houses and going after them. But I don't know what the deal is with that. That doesn't fit with his style of writing, and it's completely inappropriate for the situation. She's in there, she's checking out his study, but her priorities are to ignore her pain so that she can save China before Vest gets home, not sit there and get her head lost in the clouds for hours on end thinking about fucking Memphis, whoever the fuck that was, and Zach. Anyway, she lowered her hands from her face and looked at the open file cabinet. Vest had used 3 formats of folders with staggered tab placement, so it was easy for China to see all the names along the length of the drawer. Much further back from the Elms file was one labeled Templeton. She pushed the drawer shut with her foot. She'd found too much in the study, yet nothing helpful. Before leaving the second floor, she turned off all the lights. If Vest came home early, before China could get away with Ariel, the lights would warn him that something was amiss. He would be lulled by darkness, however, and as he crossed the threshold, she might have one last chance to kill him. She hoped it wouldn't come to that. In spite of her fantasies of pulling the trigger on Vest, China didn't want to have to confront him again, even if she found a shotgun and loaded it herself and had an opportunity to test fire it before he arrived. She was a survivor, and she was a fighter, but Vest was more than either. As unreachable as stars, something come down from a high darkness. She was no match for him, and she didn't want another chance to prove it. One tread at a time, balanced against the handrail, as fast as she dared, China went down to the living room. None of the Dobermans was at the undraped window. The mantel clock put the time at 22 minutes past 8, and suddenly the night seemed to be a sled on a slope of ice, picking up speed. She extinguished the lamp and shuffled through darkness to the kitchen. There she turned on the fluorescent lights, only to avoid tripping in the debris, falling and cutting herself in broken glass. No Dobermans were on the back porch either. At the window, only the night waited. Entering the windowless laundry room, she shut off the kitchen lights behind her and pulled the door shut. Down to the cellar, then to the workbench and cabinets that she'd seen earlier. In the tall metal cabinets with the vent slits in the door, she found cans of paint and lacquer, paintbrushes, and drop cloths, folded as precisely as fine linen sheets. One entire cabinet was filled with thick pads from which dangled black leather straps with chrome-plated buckles. She didn't have any idea what they were, and she left them undisturbed. In the final cabinet, Vest stored several power tools, including an electric drill. In one of the drawers on the big wheeled tool chest, she located an extensive collection of drill bits in 3 clear plastic boxes. She also found a pair of plexiglass safety goggles. A power strip with 8 outlets was attached to the wall behind the workbench, but a duplex receptacle was also available low on the wall beside the bench. She needed the lower outlet because it allowed her to sit on the floor. Although the drill bits weren't labeled except as to size, China figured that they were all meant for woodworking and would not bore easily, if at all, through steel. She didn't want to pierce the steel anyway. She wanted only to screw up the lock mechanisms on her leg irons enough to spring them open. She chose a bit approximately the size of the leg iron keyway, fitted it into the chuck and tightened it. When she held the drill in both hands and squeezed the trigger, it issued a shrill whine. The spiral throat of the slender bit spun so fast that it blurred until it seemed as smooth and harmless as the shank. China released the trigger, set the silent drill aside on the floor, and put on the protective goggles. She was disconcerted by the thought that Vess had worn these goggles. Strangely, she expected that everything she saw through them would be distorted, as if the molecules of the lenses had been transformed by the magnetic power with which Vess drew all the sights of his world to his eyes. But what she saw through the goggles was no different from what she saw without them, although her field of vision was circumscribed by the frames. She picked up the drill with both hands again and inserted the tip of the bit into the keyway on the shackle that encircled her left ankle. When she pressed the trigger, steel spun against steel with a hellish shriek. The bit stuttered violently, jumped out of the keyway, and skipped across the 2-inch wide shackle, spitting tiny sparks. If her reflexes hadn't been good, the whirling auger would have bored through her foot, but she released the trigger and jerked up on the drill, just in time to avoid disaster. The lock might have been damaged, she couldn't be sure, but it was still engaged and the shackle was secure. She inserted the bit into the keyway again. She gripped the drill tighter than before and bore down with more effort to keep the bit from kicking out of the hole. Steel shrieked, and blue wisps of foul-smelling smoke rose from the grinding point, and the vibrating shackle pressed painfully into her ankle in spite of the intervening sock. The drill shook in her hands, which were suddenly damp with cold sweat from the strain of controlling it. A spray of metal slivers swirled up from the keyway, spattered her face. The bit snapped, and the broken off end zinged past her head, rang off the concrete block wall hard enough to take a chip out of it, and clinked like a half-spent bullet across the cellar floor. Her left cheek stung, and she found a splinter of steel embedded in her flesh. It was about 1/4 of an inch long and as thin as a sliver of glass. She was able to grasp it between her fingernails and pluck it free. The tiny puncture was bleeding. She had blood on her fingertips and felt a thin, warm trickle making its way down her face to the corner of her mouth. She freed the shank of the broken bit from the drill and threw it aside. She selected a slightly larger bit and tightened it into the jaws of the chuck. Again, she drilled the keyway. The shackle around her left ankle popped open. Not more than a minute later, the lock on the other shackle cracked too. China put the drill aside and rose shakily to her feet, every muscle in her legs trembling. She was shaking not because of her many pains, not because of her hunger and weakness, but because she had freed herself from the shackles after having been in despair only a couple of hours before. She had freed herself. She was still handcuffed, however, and she could not hold the drill one-handed while she bored out the lock on each manacle. But she already had an idea about how she might extricate her hands. Although other challenges faced her in addition to the manacles, although escape was by no means assured, jubilation swelled in China as she climbed the cellar steps. She went tread over tread, not one step at a time, as the shackles had required, bounding up the stairs in spite of her weakness and the tremors in her muscles, without even using the handrail, to the landing, into the laundry room, past the washer and dryer. And there she abruptly halted with her hands on the knob of the closed door, remembering how she had raced along the same route and into the kitchen this morning, reassured by the tatta-tatta-tatta of the vibrating water pipe in the wall, only to be blindsided by Vess. She stood at the threshold until her breathing quieted, but she was unable to quiet her heart, which had been thundering with excitement and with the steepness of the stairs, but now pounded with fear of Edgeler Vess. She listened at the door for a while, heard nothing over the thudding in her breast, and turned the knob as stealthily as possible. The hinges operated smoothly, soundlessly, and the door opened into the kitchen, which was as dark as she had left it. She found the light switch, hesitated, flipped it up, and Vess was not waiting for her. As long as she lived, would she ever again be able to go through a doorway without flinching? From a drawer where earlier China had seen a set of cutlery, she extracted a butcher knife with a well-worn walnut handle. She put it on the counter near the sink. She got a drinking glass from another cabinet, filled it from the cold water tap, and drank the entire glassful in long swallows before lowering it from her lips. Nothing she'd ever drunk had been half as delicious as those 8 ounces. In the refrigerator, she found an unopened coffee cake with white icing, cinnamon walnuts. She ripped open the wrapper and tore off a chunk of the cake. She stood over the sink, eating voraciously, stuffing her mouth until her cheeks bulged, greedily licking icing from her lips, crumbs and chunks of walnut dropping into the sink. She was in an uncommon state of mind as she ate, now moaning with delight, now half choking with laughter, now gagging and on the verge of tears, now laughing again. In a storm of emotions, but that was okay. Storms always pass sooner or later, and they were cleansing. She had come so far, yet she had so far to go. That was the nature of the journey. From the spice rack, she removed the bottle of aspirin. She shook 2 tablets into the palm of her hand, but she didn't chew them. She drew another glass of water and took the aspirin, then took 2 more. She sang I Did It My Way from Sinatra's Standard, and then added, took the fucking aspirin my way. She laughed and ate more coffee cake, and for a moment she felt crazy with accomplishment. Dogs out there in the night, she reminded herself. Dobermans in the darkness. Rotten bastard Nazi dogs with big teeth and eyes black like shark's eyes. At a key organizer next to the spice rack, the keys to the motorhome hung from one of the 4 pegs. The other pegs were empty. Vass would be careful with the keys to the soundproof cell and would no doubt keep them on him at all times. She picked up the butcher knife and the half-eaten coffee cake and went to the cellar, turning off the kitchen lights behind her. Pintle and Gudgeon, Gudgeon. China knew these 2 exotic words, as she knew so many others, because as a girl she had encountered them in books written by C.S. Lewis and Madeleine L'Engle and Robert Louis Stevenson and Kenneth Graham. And every time that she'd come across a word she had not known, she looked it up in a tattered paperback dictionary, a prized possession that she took with her wherever her restless mother chose to drag her, year after year, until it was held together with so much age-brittled Scotch tape that she could barely read some of the definitions through the strips of yellowing cellophane. Pintle, that was the name of the pin in a hinge which pivoted when a door opened or closed. Gudgeon, that was the sleeve or barrel in which the pintle moved. The thick inner door of the soundproof vestibule was equipped with 3 hinges. The pintle in each hinge had a slightly rounded head that overhung the gudgeon by about 1/16 of an inch all the way around. From the tools in the wheeled cabinet, China selected a hammer and a screwdriver. With the workbench stool and a scrap of wood for a wedge, she propped open the outer padded door of the vestibule. Then she placed the butcher knife on the rubber mat on the vestibule floor within easy reach. She slid aside the cover on the viewport in the inner door and saw the gathering of dolls in pinkish lamplight. Some had eyes as radiant as the eyes of lizards, and some had eyes as dark as those of certain Dobermans. In the enormous armchair, Ariel sat with her legs drawn up on the seat cushion, head tipped forward, face obscured by a fall of hair. She might have been asleep, except that her hands were balled tightly in her lap. If her eyes were open, she would be staring at her fists. "It's only me," China said. The girl didn't respond. "Don't be afraid." Ariel was so motionless that even her veil of hair did not stir. "It's only me." This time, deeply humbled, China made no claim to being anyone's guardian or salvation. She started with the lowest hinge. The length of chain between her manacles was barely long enough to allow her to use the tools. She held the screwdriver in her left hand with the tip of the blade angled under the pintle cap. Without sufficient play in the manacle chain, she couldn't grasp the hammer by its handle, so she gripped it instead by the head and tapped the bottom of the screwdriver as forcefully as possible, considering the limitations on movement. Fortunately, the hinge was well lubricated, and with each tap, the pintle rose farther out of the gudgeon. 5 minutes later, in spite of some resistance from the third pin, she popped it out of the uppermost hinge. The gudgeons were formed of interleaving knuckles that were part of the hinge leaf on the door frame, and that on the inner edge of the door itself. These knuckles separated slightly because the pintles were no longer present to hold them together in a single barrel. Now the door was kept in place only by the pair of locks on the right side, but 1-inch deadbolts wouldn't swing like hinges. China pulled the padded door by the knuckles of the gudgeons. At first, only 1 inch of its 5-inch width came out of the jamb on the left, vinyl squeaking against vinyl. She hooked her fingers around this exposed edge, yanked hard, and her vision clouded with a crimson tint as the pain in her swollen finger flared again. But she was rewarded with the shrill metallic squeak of the brass deadbolts working in the striker plates, and then with a faint crack of wood as the whole lock assembly put heavy strain on the jamb. Redoubling her effort, she pulled rhythmically, prying open the door in tiny increments until she was gasping so hard that she was no longer able to curse with frustration. The weight of the door and the position of the 2 deadbolts began to work to her advantage. The locks were close together, one set directly over the other, not evenly spaced like hinges, so the heavy slab tried to twist on them as if they were a single pivot point. Because the greater length of the door lay above the locks than below, the top tipped outward, induced by gravity. China took advantage of these inevitable forces, yanked harder, and grunted with satisfaction when wood splintered again. The entire 5-inch width of the padded slab swung free of the jamb on the side that had been hinged. With the frame no longer in the way, she pulled the door to the left, and on the right side, the deadbolts slid out of the striker plates. Suddenly the door came toward her, free of all restraint, and it was too heavy to be lowered slowly out of its frame. She backed rapidly into the cellar, letting the slab thud to the floor of the vestibule just as she vacated it. China waited, catching her breath, listening to the house for any indication that Vess had returned. Finally, she re-entered the vestibule. She crossed the fallen door as if it were a bridge, and she went into the cell. The dolls watched, unmoving and sly. Ariel was sitting in the armchair, head lowered, hands fisted in her lap, exactly as she had been when China had spoken to her through the port in the door. If she had heard the hammering and subsequent commotion, she had not been disturbed by it. "Ariel?" China said. The girl didn't reply or raise her head. China sat on the footstool in front of the armchair. "Honey, it's time to go." When she received no response, China leaned forward, lowered her head, and looked up at the girl's shadowed face. Ariel's eyes were open, and her gaze was fixed on her white-knuckled fists. Her lips were moving as though she were whispering confidences to someone, but no sound escaped her. China put her cuffed hands under Ariel's chin and lifted her head. The girl didn't try to pull away, didn't flinch, but was revealed when her veil of hair slid away from her face. Although they were eye to eye, Ariel stared through China as if all in this world were transparent, and in her eyes was a chilling bleakness, as if the landscape of her other world was lifeless, daunting. "We have to go before he comes home." Bright-eyed and attentive, perhaps the dolls listened. Ariel apparently did not. With both hands, China enfolded one of the girl's fists. The bones were sharp and the skin was cold, clenched as fiercely as if she had been suspended from rocks at a precipice. China tried to pry the fingers apart. The sculpted digits of a marble fist would have been hardly more resistant. Finally, China lifted the hand and kissed it more tenderly than she had ever kissed anyone before, more tenderly than she had ever been kissed, and she said softly, "I want to help you. I need to help you, honey. If I can't leave here with you, there's no point in my leaving at all." Ariel didn't respond. "Please let me help you." Softer still, "Please." China kissed the hand once more, and at last she felt the girl's fingers stir. They opened part way, cold and stiff, but would not relax entirely, as hooked and rigid as a skeleton's fingers in which the joints had calcified. Ariel's desire to reach out for help, tempered by her paralyzing fear of commitment, was achingly familiar to China. It struck in her a chord of sympathy and pity for this girl, for all lost girls, and her throat tightened so severely that for a moment she was unable to swallow or breathe. Then she slipped one cuffed hand into Ariel's and the other over it, got up from the footstool and said, "Come on, child, come with me, out of here." Though Ariel's face remained as expressionless as an egg, though she continued to look through China with the otherworldly detachment of a novitiate in the thrall of a holy visitation, her head spinning with visions, she got up from the armchair. After taking only 2 steps toward the door, however, she stopped and would not go farther, in spite of China's pleas. The girl might be able to envision an imaginary world in which she could find a fragile peace, a wildwood of her own, but perhaps she was no longer able to imagine that this world extended beyond the walls of her cell, and, failing to visualize it, could not cross the threshold into it. China released Ariel's hand. She selected a doll, a bisque charmer with golden ringlets and painted green eyes, wearing a white eyelet pinafore over a blue dress. She pressed it against the girl's breast and encouraged her to embrace it. She wasn't sure why the collection was here, but perhaps Ariel liked the dolls, in which case she might come along more readily if given one for comfort. Initially, Ariel was unresponsive, standing with one hand still fisted at her side, and the other like a half-open crab claw. Then, without shifting her gaze from faraway things, she took the doll in both hands, gripping it by the legs. Like the shadow of a bird in flight, a fierce expression crossed her face and she was gone, and was gone before it could be clearly read. She turned, swung the doll as if it were a sledgehammer, and smashed its head into the top of the dinette table, shattering the unglazed china face. Startled, China said, "Honey, no," and gripped the girl by the shoulder. Ariel wrenched away from China and slammed the doll into the table again, harder than before. And China stepped backward, not in fear, but in respect of the girl's fury. And fury it was, a righteous anger, not merely an autistic spasm, in spite of the fact that she remained expressionless. She pounded the doll against the table repeatedly until its smashed head broke and spun across the room and bounced off a wall until both its arms cracked and fell away until it was ruined beyond repair. Then she dropped it and stood trembling, arms hanging at her sides. She was still staring into the elsewhere and was no more with China than she had ever been. From the bookcases, from atop the cabinets, from the shadow corners of the room, the dolls watched intently, as if they were thrilled by her outburst and in some strange way feeding on it, as Vess himself would have fed if he'd been hit there to see. China wanted to put her arms around the girl, but the handcuffs made it impossible to embrace her. Instead, she touched Ariel's face and kissed her on the forehead. Ariel, untouched and alive. Rigid, shaking, Ariel neither pulled away from China nor leaned toward her. Gradually, the girl's trembling subsided. "I need your help," China pleaded. "I need you." This time, as if sleepwalking, Ariel allowed herself to be led from the cell. They crossed the fallen door through the vestibule. In the cellar, China picked up the drill from the floor, plugged it into the power strip on the wall, and put it on the workbench. She had no timepiece for reference, but she was sure that 9 o'clock had come and gone. In the night were dogs waiting, and Edgeler Vest somewhere at work, bemused by waking dreams of returning home to his pair of captives. Trying unsuccessfully to get the girl's eyes to focus on her, China explained what they needed to do. She might be able to drive the motor home while handcuffed, though not without some difficulty, as she would have to let go of the steering wheel to shift gears. Dealing with the dogs while cuffed would be a lot harder, perhaps impossible. If they were to make the best use of the time remaining before Vess's return, and if they were to have the best chance of getting away, Ariel was going to have to drill out the locks on the manacles. The girl gave no indication that she heard a word of what China told her. Indeed, before China finished, Ariel's lips were moving again in a silent conversation with some phantom. She didn't, quote-unquote, speak ceaselessly, but paused from time to time as if receiving a response from an imaginary friend. Nevertheless, China showed her how to hold the drill and press the trigger. The girl didn't blink at the sudden shriek of the motor and the air-cutting whistle of the whirling bit. "Now you hold it," China said. Oblivious, Ariel stood with her arms at her sides, hands half open and fingers hooked as they had been since she had dropped the ruined doll. "We don't have much time, honey." In her clockless elsewhere, time meant nothing to Ariel. China put the drill on the workbench. She drew the girl in front of the tool and placed her hands on it. Ariel didn't pull away or let her hands slide off the drill, but she didn't lift it either. China knew that the girl heard her, understood the situation, and on some level yearned to help. Our hopes are in your hands, honey. You can do it. She retrieved the workbench stool from the outer vestibule door, which it had been propping open, and sat down. She put her hands on the workbench, wrists turned to expose the tiny keyhole in the left manacle. Staring at the concrete block wall, through the wall, speaking soundlessly to a psychic friend beyond all walls, Ariel seemed to be unaware of the drill. Or to her, it might have been not a drill, but another object altogether, one that filled her either with hope or with fear, the thing of which she spoke to her phantom friend. Even if the girl picked up the drill and focused her eyes on the manacle, the chance that she would be able to perform this task seemed slim. The chance that she would avoid boring through China's palm or wrist seemed slimmer still. On the other hand, although the likelihood of salvation from any trouble or enemy in this life was always slim, China had survived uncounted nights of blood rage and questing lust. Survival was far different from salvation, of course, but it was a prerequisite. Anyway, she was ready to do now what she had never been able to do before, not even with Laura Templeton. Trust. Trust without reservation. And if this girl tried and failed, let the drill slip and damage flesh rather than steel, China wasn't going to blame her for the failure. Sometimes just trying was a triumph. And she knew Ariel wanted to try. She knew. For a minute or so, China encouraged the girl to begin, and when that didn't work, she tried waiting in silence. But silence led her thoughts to the bronze stags and the clock over which they leaped on the living room mantel. And in her mind's eye, the clock acquired the face of the young man who hung in the motorhome closet, eyelids tightly stitched and lips sewn shut in silence even deeper than that in the cellar. With no calculation, surprised to hear what she was doing but relying on instinct, China began to tell Ariel what had happened on the long-ago night of her 8th birthday. The cottage in Key West, the storm, Jim Waltz, the frantic palmetto beetle under the low-slung iron bed. Drunk on Dos Equis and high on a pair of small white pills that he had popped with the first bottle of beer, Waltz had teased China because she had failed to blow out all the candles on her birthday cake in a single breath, leaving one aflame. "This is bad luck, kid. Oh man, this brings a world of grief down on us. If you don't get all the candles out, you invite gremlins and trolls into your life, all sorts of bad characters after your stash and cash." Just then the night sky had convulsed with white light, and the shadows of palm fronds had leaped across the kitchen windows. The cottage rattled in the shock waves of thunderclaps as hard as bomb blasts, and the storm broke. "See," Waltz said, "if we don't rectify this situation right away, then some bad guys will get the best of us and chop us up into bloody chunks and put us in bait buckets and go out in some deep-sea boat, trolling for sharks, using us as chum. Do you want to be shark chum, kid?" This speech frightened China, but her mother found it amusing. Her mother had been drinking vodka with lemonade since late afternoon. Waltz relit the candles and insisted that China try once more. When she failed again to extinguish more than 7 with one breath, Wolf seized her hand, licked her thumb and index finger, his tongue lingering in a way that disgusted her, and then forced her to snuff the remaining flame by pinching the candle wick. Although there was a brief hotness against her skin, she had not been burned. However, her fingers had been marked with black smudges from the smoking wick, and the sight of them had terrified her. When China began to cry, Waltz held her by one arm, keeping her in her chair, while Anne relit the 8, insisting that she try again. The third time, China was able to extinguish only 6 candles with her first shuddery breath. When Waltz attempted to make her pinch both flames with her fingers, she pulled loose and ran out of the kitchen, intending to flee to the beach, but lightning had shattered like bright mirrors around the cottage, the night flashing with sharp silver fragments, and thunder as fierce as the cannonades of warships boomed out of the Gulf of Mexico. So she had fled instead to the small room in which she slept, crawled under the sagging bed, into those secret shadows where the palmetto beetle waited. Waltz, the stinking son of a bitch, came through the house after me, China told Ariel, shouting my name, knocking over furniture, slamming doors, saying he was going to chop me up for chum and then scatter me in the sea. Later, I realized it was an act. He'd been trying to scare the crap out of me. He always liked to scare me, make me cry, because I didn't cry easily, never easily. China stopped, unable to go on. Ariel stared not toward the wall as before, but down at the power drill on which her hands were placed. Whether she saw the drill was another matter. Her eyes were still far away. The girl might not be listening, yet China felt compelled to tell the rest of what had happened that night in Key West. This was the first time she had ever revealed to anyone other than Laura any of the things that had happened to her when she was a child. Shame had always silenced her, which was inexplicable because none of the degradation she endured had resulted from her own actions. She had been a victim, small and defenseless, yet she was burdened with the shame that all her tormentors, including her mother, were incapable of feeling. She had hidden some of the worst details of her past even from Laura Templeton, her only good friend. Often on the brink of a revelation to Laura, she would pull back from disclosure and speak not about the events that she had endured, and not about the people who had tormented her, but about places. Key West, Mendocino County, New Orleans, San Francisco, Wyoming, where she had lived. She was lyrical when the subject was the natural beauty of mountains, plains, bayous, or low, moonlit breakers rolling in from the Gulf of Mexico. But she could feel anger tightening her face and shame coloring it when she told the harder truths about the friends of Anne who had populated her childhood. Now her throat was tight. She was curiously aware of the heavy weight of her heart, like a stone in her chest, heavy with the past. Sick with shame and anger, she nevertheless sensed that she must finish telling Ariel what had happened during that Florida night of unextinguished candles. Revelation might be a door out of darkness.